The First World War. It had been a cataclysmic event that left Europe in ruins, an entire generation shattered. The war's aftermath saw the collapse of empires, the rise of new ideologies, and the birth of the United States as a true global power. But peace, as President Woodrow Wilson hoped, would not come easy. His vision of a new world order would struggle against both the realities of global politics and the isolationist sentiment that was brewing back at home. And as the world entered a new decade, America's place in it would be forever altered. In this episode, we explore the interwar years, from Wilson's struggles to the rise of FDR, the Great Depression, and the outbreak of the Second World War, examining not just the politics, but also the transformation at home and abroad as the U.S. navigated the complexities of a changing world. You're listening to APush Through History, a resource designed to help students completing the course of AP US History. This episode covers the third subject of Period 7, 1890 to 1945, the birth of a superpower. The year 1919 brought both triumph and tragedy for Woodrow Wilson. After leading the U.S. through the Great War, Wilson's vision for lasting peace was embodied in his 14 points, a blueprint for a new world order based on democracy, self-determination, and international cooperation. At its heart was the League of Nations, an organization designed to prevent future conflicts. Wilson's triumph at Versailles was short-lived. While he returned to a hero's welcome in the U.S., his treaty was met with fierce opposition in the Senate. Many Americans, especially Republicans, feared that joining the League of Nations would entangle the U.S. in Europe's problems. Led by opposition leader Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the Senate rejected the treaty, and the U.S. refused to join the league that it had created. America, despite its wartime victory, retreated back into isolationism. Knowing what comes makes us look back at this decision as shocking, but the absence of war had revealed that a number of sensational stories regarding World War I had been proven false, embodying those who had sought to maintain American neutrality in a war which did not directly affect them. The rejection of the League of Nations, as well as the passage of congressional neutrality acts, sought to right those wrongs, ensuring that America would never again be manipulated by its leaders into going to war. The president put up a strong fight, however, embarking on a nationwide tour to convince the American public to pressure their senators into changing their minds. The trek was as exhausting as it was futile, and in the fall of 1919, Wilson suffered a major stroke. His health deteriorated, and for much of the remaining time in office, his wife effectively managed his affairs, an instance that remains unprecedented in American history. Without his voice, Wilson's idealism about international peace crumbled, and with it, America's involvement in the world. The 1920s, or Roaring Twenties, seemed to promise a bright future. The economy was booming in the immediate aftermath of World War I, and a sense of optimism filled the air. Not only was manufacturing at an all-time high, but farm prices had gone through the roof as demand for exports surged in the aftermath of the devastation that was inflicted upon Europe during World War I. But beneath the glitz and glamour, serious problems were brewing. Under Republican presidents like Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, the U.S. embraced pro-business policies, cutting taxes for the wealthy and placing tariffs on foreign goods. The stock market boomed, fueled by speculation, and consumer debt soared. But beneath the surface, the economy was fragile. Farmers, especially in the Great Plains, were struggling with overproduction, and industrial workers faced stagnant wages against inflation rates that averaged 15% across the decade. By the end of the 20s, it was clear that the economy wasn't as strong as it appeared. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crash hit like a thunderclap. Herbert Hoover, elected president the year prior, now faced the worst economic collapse in U.S. history. His response, however, was one of inaction. Hoover believed that the economy would eventually recover on its own and rejected direct government intervention. Instead, he pushed for voluntary cooperation among businesses and hoped the nation's volunteerism would pull it out of the crisis. It didn't. And Hoover's failure to respond quickly and decisively led to widespread criticism. There's still debate over the fundamental causes of the Depression, but most agree that the economic prosperity of the Roaring Twenties had depended on too few industries. For instance, the affordability of the Model T Ford opened up the possibility for many families to own their first car. But sales declined by 1/3 in the first 9 months of 1929 as the market had become oversaturated. The housing industry experienced similar problems between 1926 and 1929 as supply began to outstrip demand. Furthermore, the imbalance of the economy, which had more than 50% living at or below the poverty line, meant that there wasn't enough proper distribution of wealth to maintain an upward trajectory. While industrial goods were being produced, there weren't enough consumers who could afford them. Farmers had amassed too much credit during the Roaring Twenties, and when inflation ate away their profits, they defaulted in huge numbers, causing small banks to go under, which in turn stressed the large banks. The biggest problem, however, for the large banks was their irresponsible investment in the stock market, as they took their clients' money to buy stock. Such an action was fine if the market went up. But when the crash came, millions of Americans lost money that they had invested without their permission. It didn't help the European nations defaulted on their wartime loans to the U.S. They had hoped that reparations imposed on Germany would suffice, but the failure of the Weimar German economy meant that they had to pay out of their own pockets. When they defaulted, the nation's largest banks lost all hope, with many of them closing their doors and declaring bankruptcy. The stock market crash of 1929 thus did not so much cause the Depression as helped to trigger a chain of events that exposed long-standing weaknesses in the American economy. 9,000 banks went under between 1930 and 1933. Robbing Americans of more than $2.5 billion in savings. Cities became paralyzed by unemployment, and the slogan Hoovervilles began to describe the legions of homeless Americans sleeping in the streets covered in Hoover blankets, slang for a newspaper. In Cleveland, unemployment reached 50%, while Toledo experienced 80% of its population unemployed. It wasn't just tight budgets that prevented state and local governments from addressing the problem, as the underlying view during this period was that poor people were lazy and that the expansion of welfare would merely enable that laziness. It wasn't just in the cities either, as farm income declined by 60% between 1929 and 1932, with 1/3 of all farmers losing their land. Worse, the Great Plains simultaneously suffered a decade-long natural drought that became known as the Dust Bowl. In the South, limited relief and unemployment often went to whites over African Americans. The experience was similar in the Southwest, as Mexicans were excluded from all relief programs, as well as Asian Americans. The president began to act towards the end of his first term, but it was far too little, far too late. He proposed to Congress an increase of $423 million in federal public works programs, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to what was needed. Even worse than his response to the economic crisis was his dealings with the Bonus Army, a group of World War I veterans who marched on Washington in an attempt to get an advance on the $1,000 bonus that was planned to be paid out in 1945. Rather than receiving their money, the former heroes were assaulted by members of the 3rd Cavalry, allowing General Douglas MacArthur to burn down the protesters' tent city. The overreaction would serve as the final blow to Hoover's already battered presidency. In 1932, in the midst of the Great Depression, Hoover was swept from office, defeated by a wave of public discontent. The nation turned to a new leader with fresh ideas: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, he faced an economic nightmare. Unemployment remained nationwide at 25%, and the banking system was on the brink of collapse. Roosevelt, incredibly optimistic, quickly enacted the New Deal, a series of bold programs aimed at providing relief, recovery, and reform. The first 100 days saw Congress pass a flurry of legislation: the Emergency Banking Act, which closed banks for a few days to stop the panic and allowed only healthy banks to reopen; the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, which provided jobs for young men to build infrastructure and conserve natural resources; as well as the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which created millions of jobs for Americans across the country. Determined to leave no stone unturned, FDR led the overturning of Prohibition via the passage of the 21st Amendment, in hopes of providing a jump start to the economy. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, oversaw the president's rural electrification program, extending the benefits of electricity across the country. The controversial program was the beginnings of the government pushing out private utilities in favor of government-controlled regional utility companies. At the same time, Roosevelt reformed the nation's financial system. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking to prevent another crash, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, was established to protect individual deposits. The Social Security Act, passed in 1935, created a system of unemployment insurance and pensions for the elderly. Despite the wide-reaching success of the New Deal, it was far from perfect. The programs didn't always reach the most vulnerable groups. Many African Americans, for example, found themselves excluded from certain relief programs, and the New Deal's benefits were often more limited for minorities than for white Americans. It also faced stiff pushback from the courts, resulting in the president pursuing a court-packing scheme that would have seen him appoint new Supreme Court justices favorable to his policies. Still, Roosevelt's New Deal fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the government and the American people, creating a new expectation that the federal government had a responsibility to protect the welfare of its citizens. He was easily reelected in 1936, despite not having come out completely from the Great Depression. His success came from a party realignment, which saw Democrats controlling a broad coalition of Western and Southern farmers, the urban working classes, the poor and unemployed, and the black communities of northern cities, as well as traditional progressives. He further tied African Americans to the Democratic Party after establishing a so-called Black Cabinet, which saw a significant number of second-level positions who worked informally to guide the president towards policies which would improve the everyday lives of African Americans. While their bank accounts improved, FDR didn't destroy the existing systems of discrimination in America. The Civilian Conservation Corps even established separate camps for black workers, and the National Relief Administration paid blacks less than whites for doing the exact same jobs. The Works Progress Administration regularly relegated black, Hispanic, and Asian workers to the least skilled and lowest paying jobs, while the TVA excluded them entirely from employment. As terrible as this sounds, it was normal for the time, with Brinkley noting that the New Deal was not hostile to African Americans, and it did much to help them advance. Similar prevailing gender norms were upheld for women, limiting them to only symbolic gains during the New Deal, as well as Native Americans, who through the Indian Reorganization Act saw their tribal land increase by nearly 4 million acres. Much of the new land, however, was merely unproductive land that white citizens had long abandoned. Indian policy during this time remained hell-bent towards assimilation. While Roosevelt worked to pull America out of the Great Depression, the world around the U.S. was increasingly unstable. In the 1930s, as Europe plunged into economic depression, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, promising to rebuild the country and restore its former glory. His radical Nazi ideology, which combined nationalism, racism, and militarism, began to shape German policy. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, marking the start of World War II. Meanwhile, Japan had begun its own imperialist march across Asia. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, setting the stage for its further expansion into China. By the late 1930s, Japan's military was clashing with Chinese forces, and the U.S. found itself torn between staying out of the conflict and supplying economic and military aid to countries like China. The U.S. public, still reeling from the Great Depression, favored isolationism. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts in the 1930s to prevent the U.S. from becoming entangled in foreign conflicts. But as Nazi Germany's aggression spread across Europe, Roosevelt became increasingly convinced that the U.S. could not stand idly by. He called for America to become the arsenal of democracy, providing arms and supplies to the Allies without directly engaging in the war. It was a change from his good neighbor policy, which boosted relations between America and its southern neighbors by formally declaring that no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. Now, the United States abided by the directive of the long-standing Monroe Doctrine, allowing no nation, not even itself, to interfere in Latin America. America's neutrality was tested when the League of Nations failed to stop Italian fascist Benito Mussolini from invading Ethiopia. After Imperial Japan invaded China, FDR gave what became known as the Quarantine Speech, proclaiming that aggressors like Japan should be quarantined by the international community in order to prevent the contagion of war from spreading. But the forces of isolationism were too strong. The America First movement enlisted the celebrity voice of Charles Lindbergh, the first man to solo fly across the Atlantic. He pushed the concept of Fortress America, claiming that reliance upon the oceans and air power would be enough to keep America safe. He was joined by Charles Coughlin, a racist Catholic priest, and Henry Ford, who at one point would proclaim that America needed its own source of Holocaust-styled labor. The president tried a number of tricks to work around the Congressional Neutrality Acts, which he himself had signed in order to secure congressional votes in support of his New Deal initiatives. In 1939, FDR got Congress to agree to cash and carry provisions, which would allow nations like England to pay in cash, avoiding the debt problem that had occurred during World War I, as long as they carried the weapons back on their own ships, which would prevent a Lusitania situation with a German U-boat killing Americans. After France fell, the president asked Congress for an additional $1 billion to build up defense. After it became impossible for England to meet the requirements of cash and carry, the president traded 50 American destroyers in return for the right to build American bases on British territory. FDR broke tradition by running for an unprecedented third term. His opposition didn't do enough to distinguish himself, and although it was closer than his prior campaigns, FDR was re-elected with 55% of the vote. With the election behind him, the president made profound changes to the American role in the war. For instance, he began to circumvent the Navigation Acts via Lend-Lease, which saw the president lend bullets and ships to England. After Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, FDR extended Lend-Lease to the Russians in an effort to bring them into an anti-Nazi alliance. That alliance of the Big Three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, was cemented when FDR and Churchill met in April 1941 aboard a ship in the Atlantic. While the U.S. didn't agree to join the war, the agreed-upon Atlantic Charter spelled out common principles for a post-war world. He also cut off Germany's ally Japan from American oil, leaving Tokyo with the choice of either repairing its relations with America or finding those critical supplies elsewhere. They chose the latter, lashing out at island nations across the Pacific Ocean, bringing them closer and closer to the Hawaiian Islands. After talks broke down, it became clear that Japan was intending to attack the United States, but the code breakers weren't sure where or exactly when. On December 7, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's hopes of staying out of the war. The attack killed over 2,400 Americans and sunk or damaged much of the Pacific Fleet. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress and declared war on Japan, marking America's official entry into World War II. Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the U.S. just days later, and America was thrust into a global conflict on two fronts: the Pacific against Japan, and Europe against Nazi Germany. The war effort reshaped America at home in profound ways. With millions of men serving overseas, women stepped into jobs traditionally held by men. The Rosie the Riveter campaign symbolized this new role for women as they worked in factories producing war materials. In fact, during the war, nearly 6 million women entered the workforce. The Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities continued during the war, as industrial jobs became available in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. However, despite the new job opportunities, African Americans faced racism and discrimination, both in the workplace and in the military. Many were relegated to segregated units, such as the famous Tuskegee Airmen. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were rounded up and placed in internment camps for fear that they represented a fifth column. Despite also being at war with Germany and Italy, Americans of European descent were merely treated with suspicion. The Supreme Court in Korematsu v. U.S. upheld Executive Order 9066 as constitutional, but the United States would later pay reparations for their actions taken against Japanese Americans. There was racism in the decision, but not every decision made during this period was racist, as the American government finally repealed the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which had barred nearly all Chinese immigration since 1882. While the new quota was only a mere 105 per year, the repeal was a symbolic act to our World War II ally China. Fighting occurred on both fronts simultaneously, but America would not make a major breakthrough until D-Day. That operation, which was named Operation Overlord, saw the US, British, French, and Canadian armed forces launch 5 simultaneous attacks against the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall. Even here, the operation depended upon serious luck. The German tanks didn't reinforce their positions in time, as Hitler's generals were afraid to wake him from a nap. Once he was up, he remained reluctant, as German intelligence was convinced that the real attack was still to come. This was because the Allies had broken the German code, spying upon their communications while allowing some known German spies to witness General George Patton, the lead American general training a secret army in northern England. Held at a distance, the spies had no clue that the secret army was made up of old men and women in borrowed uniforms. The Germans, on the other hand, never cracked the US code, which saw Navajo code talkers speaking their native language. Although there was serious fighting after D-Day, the war was effectively decided once the Allies breached continental Europe. Repeatedly, the Germans were beaten back on both fronts as the Americans and Russians competed to see who would arrive in Berlin first. As the war raged on, the atrocities of the Holocaust unfolded in Nazi-occupied Europe. 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated, alongside millions of others: Roma, disabled individuals, and political dissenters. The US government knew about these atrocities through first-hand testimonies and intelligence reports smuggled from behind enemy lines. But efforts to act on this knowledge were controversial and limited. After hearing first-hand testimony by a diplomat who had been in a concentration camp, the president refused to ask questions. That diplomat later took his own life in an attempt to convince the world to wake up to what the Nazis were doing to the Jewish people. In 1943, the Bermuda Conference between the US and Britain failed to address the issue of rescuing Jews, serving just as a political stunt. In fact, the US turned away the St. Louis, a ship carrying Jewish refugees in 1939, forcing it to return to wartime Europe. Old immigration quota laws made it impossible to act, even to save children. While the US could have bombed the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, a critical route to the death camps, the decision was made not to do so, as some argued that such actions might detract from the military objective of defeating Nazi Germany. American forces did, however, liberate camps that were along their path, refusing to divert any resources under the belief that the best way to help the Jews was to end the war quickly. Most camps, however, were in Eastern Europe, making it a logistical impossibility to intervene from their position. As the war wound down in Europe, the Pacific conflict raged on. The U.S. faced increasingly brutal resistance from Japan. On Okinawa, the Japanese fought to the bitter end, and it became clear that an invasion of Japan would result in horrendous casualties. There, Japanese civilians were given 2 grenades, one to use on the enemy and one to use on their own family. Japanese propaganda had succeeded in convincing the Japanese that the Americans were violent barbarians, when in reality it was the Japanese who had committed countless war crimes during the conflict, including the rape of Nanking and the Bataan Death March. The Die for the Emperor campaign made the prospect of ending the war even more dire, convincing the American war planners that there was no such thing as an innocent in Japan. After all, the women and children of Okinawa had grabbed kitchen knives in their attempt to harm American soldiers. In response to the threats that the Germans and Japanese posed, President Roosevelt authorized the creation of the Manhattan Project, a top-secret initiative to develop an atomic bomb. The project culminated in a successful test on July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico. After Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away during his 4th presidential term, newly elevated Harry Truman faced an agonizing decision. Should the U.S. use the bomb to force Japan's surrender, or should they continue conventional warfare? On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, leading to Japan's unconditional surrender. These weren't the first 2 cities destroyed by American bombing runs, but they were the only ones done with a mere single warhead. The Soviets were at the front of the American president's mind, leading many to believe that the bombs were dropped to prevent the USSR from entering the war in order to claim spoils during the peace negotiations. As such, the end of World War II brought about the beginning of a new global order. America emerged as the dominant superpower, something that it codified in the newly created United Nations, with a permanent Security Council staffed by the 5 victorious powers of World War II: the US, England, France, China, and Russia. The war also had profound effects on domestic politics. The post-war economic boom, the rise of the civil rights movement, and the struggle to come to terms with America's role in the global conflicts of the 20th century would set the stage for the next chapter in U.S. history.